Well, welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I'm Dr. Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College right here in Middletown, Connecticut. And joining me today is Steve Krevisky, who has been on the show before. He teaches math at the college. He's been teaching math for a very long time.
28 years.
Yeah, that's a very long time. Yeah. He teaches everything all the way up through calculus. But apart from that, his real passion, I think, is baseball. The last time you were on the show, Steve, it was spring, and we were just talking about the season coming up. But now we've got some record to discuss. So I'm just going to open it up to you. Tell me, what stands out for you in terms of the leagues and what's important for our listeners to know about the 2013 baseball season.
We just passed the 100 game mark, so that's about 5/8 of the season, little algebra for people out there. And we just also had the All-Star game that the American League won 3-0. So that means that the American League gets home field advantage in the upcoming World Series. When we were talking about the season back a few months ago, as per what you mentioned, one of the things that I anticipated at the time was that the American League East would be very tight. And with the exception of Toronto, which has been a disappointment, although they did surge for a while, there's only about 7 games separating the first place Red Sox from the fourth place Yankees. Tampa's been surging. They got David Price back, who's last year's Cy Young Award winner. And Baltimore has continued their good play, building on what they did last year. The Yankees, me being a Yankee fan, so don't throw tomatoes at me for you listeners out there. We've been trying to deal with all the injuries with Jeter and A-Rod, Granderson, Teixeira, and playing with cast-offs from other teams and minor league prospects, many of whom haven't panned out. One of the things that will be of note in the next several days is there's the July 31st trading deadline coming up next Wednesday. In fact, right around the time when I'll be at the Sabre convention in Philadelphia, the convention of the Society for American Baseball Research. So there'll be deals being made to buy players and sell players and stuff like that. In fact, last night when the Yankees were playing the Texas Rangers, the Texas starter was Matt Garza, whom Texas had just acquired from the Cubs. So I would anticipate a number of other deals like that in the next several days. I know, Anna, you're a Cardinals fan, so I'm pleased to tell you that the Cardinals are doing very well. They've been in first place. They were on the cover of this recent Sports Illustrated, The Cardinal Way, and so I brought a few of these in. The Cardinals are doing very well, partly because of their pitching. Adam Wainwright, back from an injury, has 13 wins. The top 2 batting average leaders in the National League are Cardinals, Yadier Molina and Alan Craig, at least as of a few days ago. If there's any Pirate fans in the audience, and I know people in the system who are Pirate fans, they're doing very well after 20 years of losing records. So if they keep up and don't collapse in the second half, there's a good chance that the Pirates will be in the playoffs for the first time in quite some time.
Let me interrupt you to say that we have to take a break. But when we come back, I'm interested to hear more about the dynamics of the season this year, and I'm also curious about baseball research. So, welcome back. I'm Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, and I've got a resident baseball expert, and I mean brilliant expert, here with me today, Steve Krevisky. And so we were just talking about the 2013 baseball season and passing 100 games and coming up to the trading deadline. But you mentioned the Sabre group, so Society of American Baseball Researchers. Tell me about who they are, like what kind of people are researchers and what are they researching?
Well, Sabre is actually an international organization of baseball enthusiasts. There are chapters all around the country, Canada, Puerto Rico, Japan, the UK, and I know someone in the Czech Republic who's the head of the Czech Baseball Federation. I'm the president of the Connecticut Smokey Joe Wood chapter, and so chapters have regular meetings where members do presentations. A number of our Connecticut members are authors who've written books about a number of topics. Sabre has a number of committees involved in research involving records, ballparks, Negro leagues, women in baseball, business of baseball, baseball in the movies. I also chair the Games and Simulation Committee because I manage the Yankees in a fantasy simulation league, and that's a whole area in and of itself. Some of you out there might know about fantasy football and things of that nature. So in terms of your question about research, members are involved in writing biographies of players and teams. You mentioned the Cardinals. The 60s Cardinals had a lot of tremendous players, Lou Brock, Curt Flood, Bob Gibson, etc. They got Roger Maris from the Yankees, who helped them win in 67 and 68.
Julian Javier.
Yes, that's right. Dick Road at shortstop, at Ken Boyer at third.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm back at Busch Stadium.
That's right. But in terms of research, one of the Sabre committees corrected a record from years ago. In 1930, a player named Hack Wilson, who happens to have the same birthday as I do, set a still existing U.S. Major League record with then 190 runs batted in, or RBIs. So the Records Committee found an extra RBI, probably looking through box scores and old accounts, and therefore concluded that the record actually should be 191. So in terms of having accurate records, research on the effect of ballparks on player statistics, there is a statistics committee which looks at things like what we call sabermetrics, a term Bill James used in the 80s, to talk about how we use math and statistics to analyze baseball players and teams, and how older measures like batting average are not that useful anymore because one batter could hit 300, another batter could hit 250, but in some respects maybe the 250 hitter walked a lot and actually maybe produced more runs than the 300 hitter did. So at the convention we hear presentations about, be it different statistical models, it could be a presentation about a famous baseball player who did something that should be more well commemorated. We have a business meeting to hear what's going on in the organization. I'm doing a presentation along with someone from the New York Sabre chapter about a Philadelphia theme, since that's where the convention is. It's called 52 and 52, how Bobby Shantz and Robin Roberts, both Philadelphia pitchers, combined to win 52 games in 1952. And that was one of the rare years that both Philadelphia teams were in the first division at the same time, because for many years both Philadelphia teams were doormats. So we'll be doing that. And to get just a chance at the convention to see old friends whom we only maybe see once a year, and the convention is in different places around the country. Last year the convention was in your old stomping grounds out in Minneapolis.
Oh, right.
And we got to see Target Field for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that that many people also like at the convention is we also have player panels. So we get to listen to former players and their reminiscences about their playing time and stuff like that. And that's something that people enjoy doing. And also, Friday night is ball game night. So a week from tomorrow, we'll be seeing the Phillies and Braves in Citizens Park in Philadelphia. Last year we saw the Twins in the new ballpark, and unfortunately the Twins aren't doing very well. Even though Joe Mauer, who's won 3 batting titles as a catcher, is having a bounce-back season, being healthier.
It takes a whole team, though.
Yes,
you cannot win on the back of 1 or 2 players.
Absolutely.
Right.
I would agree.
Right. Well, who's Smokey Joe?
Well, Smokey Joe Wood was a famous pitcher from about 100 years ago. He was born out west in Kansas, and he pitched for the Boston Red Sox. He had a major season in 1912, and last year, which was the centennial of Fenway Park, was also the anniversary of Wood winning 34 games as a pitcher, losing only 5. And he faced off against Walter Johnson in September of 1912 in a famous duel in Fenway Park, which Wood won by a score of 1-0. In those days, in the dead ball era, runs were hard to come by because the pitchers could throw the spitball and cut the ball and do all sorts of things like that.
I just learned about dead balls by reading that book by Dennis Lehane, which included
Yes.
the sort of vignettes about Babe Ruth. So what's a dead ball?
Well, the dead ball era signifies that since pitchers could cut the ball and do all sorts of things, while there was some high batting averages in those days, power was very low. Someone could lead the league in home runs with maybe 8 or even 10, which would be a month for good hitters in today's game. And also, if a ball was hit into the stands, the ball had to be returned. So they would play with the same ball until it could be discolored and maybe even blackened and maybe even misshapen, as opposed to today, balls hit in the stands and whoever catches it keeps it. So in the dead ball era, the way the game was played with low scoring, there was a big emphasis on what's nowadays called little ball. Bunting, stealing, hit and running, sacrificing, pinch hitting at the right time, stuff like that, because runs were so hard to come by. Pitchers' earned run averages were routinely below 2, that being a measure of how many earned runs does a pitcher give up per 9 innings pitched. So nowadays, if a pitcher had an earned run average under 2, with today's offensive conditions, like Greg Maddux or Pedro Martinez in the 90s, that would be truly outstanding. In the dead ball era, ERAs below 2 were pretty routine. If someone had an earned run average of 3 in the dead ball era, that would have been considered very high, versus that would be pretty good in today's standards.
So how did they make the transition from the dead ball era to now the umpires check, right, to be sure that the balls are still in good shape?
Yes, that's right.
So what provoked them to change the rules? Was there some event or some leader or?
Well, toward the end of the 19-teens decade, there was the famous Black Sox Scandal, where the White Sox were playing the Reds in the World Series, and 8 White Sox players were accused of throwing the series involving gambling and stuff like that. And so that's a whole story in and of itself, that there was a trial, and although evidence mysteriously disappeared and the 8 were acquitted, new Commissioner Landis banned all 8 players from the game after the 1920 season. So that was an issue in terms of the integrity of baseball, although there had previously been gambling and other fixes before. That wasn't really new. And I think changes were made in how the ball was formed. And then Babe Ruth came along, who turned out to have a lot of power, who started hitting a lot of home runs, even while he was also pitching for the Red Sox. So in 1919, he had 29 home runs. And so with the advent of Babe Ruth and other strong hitters like George Sisler, Rogers Hornsby, and others, and the changes in the ball and baseball trying to deal with its tarnished image, then 1920 began what was called the live ball era.
And so it's good. The contrast is dead ball, live ball.
Yes.
I didn't realize that.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. Well, and the players, they certainly began with Babe Ruth to get better salaries and better treatment, right? I mean, I had the sense that they weren't as very well organized. So the salaries could be different, and certainly you could be let go, you could be cut without much recourse. And so there must have been a kind of a mobilizing of a sense of them as not a union per se, but where they had rights that they could establish as players versus the owners, right? There would have been owners on the other side. We'll take that up when we come right back. Well, welcome back. I'm Anna Wasesha at Middlesex Community College, and I'm with Steve Krevisky, our baseball guru at the college and math professor on the side. And we were just talking about baseball bats. We were first of all talking about dead balls and live balls. So the baseball itself really has changed in, 100 years, but they used to use a ball till it wasn't usable at all, and it could very clearly have confounded the ability of a batter to hit it and get it out into the field. But what about baseball bats? What's the situation with baseball bats?
Well, 1997, when the Sabre convention was in Louisville, Kentucky, we got to visit the Louisville Slugger factory. In fact, there's a huge bat just outside of the factory. So we got a tour of it, and we saw how the bats were made. And players would normally order several bats because bats can break. You often see, if you watch on TV or in person, the bat breaks and one half goes in one direction, the other half goes in the other direction. And players can order bats made to their specification depending upon how long they want the bat to be. Do they want a thin handle, a thick handle, things of that nature.
So people have their own bats, sort of like customized bats? Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I would think so, because some, depending also on what type of hitter you are, if you're a power hitter versus a singles hitter, then you would want a bat that you feel comfortable with. And so bats could be maybe 32 inches long or 34 or 36, and you could have a thin handle or a thick handle. Sometimes you hear on the broadcast the talk about that the batter hit the ball on the sweet part of the bat. That's sort of down the barrel, not at the end, but there's certain spots on the bat where if you hit the ball at that spot and you've got the right kind of swing, the ball's going to carry pretty far.
So you would have started thinking about a sweet spot on a bat long before you could actually do any kind of measurements of it. So this goes back to this research question, because you've got a baseball bat and a baseball and you've got a player. And obviously, I assume we know quite a lot more now about just the physical mechanics of the human body that are able to hit a ball at a certain distance, and also the pitching speed, right? We can measure the pitching speed, and the pitching speed is high, right? A pro pitcher in the major leagues is sending that ball over the plate at how many miles per hour?
The fastest pitchers in history, people like, Bob Feller, Walter Johnson, you mentioned Smokey Joe Wood, others more recently, Nolan Ryan, would throw about 100 miles an hour. There's like the jug guns that you see at the ballpark to measure that. Now, a little math for you people out there, if you want to indulge a little bit. Miles per hour times 22/15 equals feet per second. So if you think about how much time the batter has to react, you can, since rate times time equals distance, you can figure out how long it takes, and it's basically the batter has less than half a second to judge the speed of the ball, the spin of the ball, is it breaking up, down, in, or out. They have all these instantaneous decisions that they have to make in terms of, do they swing or do they hold up. And also if the pitcher has good control, if they don't walk a lot of people, if they can put the ball where they want, then that could make it tough for the batter.
Well, Kirby Puckett, who played for the Twins when they were in the World Series, always used to make the sign of the cross before he would step to the plate with a bat in his hand. He was a really good hitter.
Yes, he was.
But there's but you can see why you sometimes invoke a little extra help if you have to make that decision in a half a second.
Yes.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Yes, and also a batter has to be fearless in the sense that the ball could come inside on you, and you can't be afraid of being knocked down.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, you're being a Cardinal fan, pitchers like Bob Gibson routinely pitched inside to push the batter off the plate. Now, certain batters like Frank Robinson, if you got them mad and you knocked him down, he'd probably hit the next pitch over the fence. So there's that sort of game within the game, among other things, the pitcher and the batter each battling to see, who would win out in that situation.
How long does a pro player have, realistically, to be at the top of their game? How long does somebody stay in the major leagues?
I think that's a very good question. The really good ones establish themselves in their early 20s. Sometimes maybe an exceptional player might be good at like maybe age 18 or 19. But in terms of maturity, by their early 20s, a number of the great players already started to make their mark. Thinking about, Mickey Mantle, Eddie Matthews, Mel Ott, Jimmy Fox are more recent players. And the power hitters typically, by the time they get to 35, then they're not getting around on the fastball as much as they used to. Now, some people have played into their 40s. Paul Molitor's from St. Paul. Dave Winfield, who, by the way, was born the day Thompson hit his famous home run, which was also, for you movie folks, that was when Sonny got shot in The Godfather, as an aside. That happened on October 3rd, 1951. So there were some exceptional players. Hank Aaron played into his 40s, Babe Ruth. But Mickey Mantle, Jimmy Fox, and other power hitters, as great as they were, started to lose it by the time they were 35. So if you're fortunate to be reasonably healthy, you can play 20 years, but you're not going to be in your prime for all those 20 years. So as it related to your question from before about research, sometimes in my stat classes, if I'm talking about mean, standard deviation, measures of data, I might take Mantle, Mays, and Aaron, three of the great stars of my childhood and teens, and do the descriptive statistics on, let's say, their 10 or 12 best years when they were in their prime, because then you've got some comparability because they all played at the same time. Now, sometimes players come up and you hear talk about they're the next Mantle or Mays or Aaron, but they don't always work out. So if a player can get 15 or so good years, then they've had a good career.
Do you think that's the chief justification for the high salaries they earn, or is there something more that goes into how much money we pay these pro players?
That's an excellent question, and that ties to what you asked about before the break about the historical aspect, because until free agency in the 70s, baseball had what was called a reserve clause that tied the player to the team for the duration of the player's career. And unless the owner traded or cut the players really didn't have any rights. And going back to the 19th century, in 1890, there was a league called the Players' League, where the players tried to run the league by themselves, but that unfortunately didn't last very long. But for most of history, until the last 40 years, players got very low salaries. A lot of the conditions of the playing fields were often very primitive. Gloves were very small. There could be rocks on the field. The modern ballparks, like let's say Fenway Park in 1912, Wrigley in Chicago, or Shibe Park in 1909, or Forbes Field, the newer parks were advancements, but playing conditions often weren't very good. And some of the players played a very rough style of play, especially the 1890s Baltimore Orioles, exemplified by John McGraw, who later managed the New York Giants in the Polo Grounds. So players didn't really have a whole lot of leverage. And you're thinking about the Yankees of the 50s, though I didn't know this until a lot later. George Weiss, the Yankee general manager, who also was not enlightened about racial matters, which is a whole other story as opposed to the Dodgers, was a very tough negotiator. And players would negotiate with Weiss, or try to, and he would say, well, you're going to get a World Series check anyway, because the Yankees in the 50s won almost all the time. So that was a tool, an a ploy he used to keep salaries down. And if people were tough negotiators, like pitcher Vic Raschi, who's from up in Springfield, by the way, the Springfield Rifle, Raschi was a tough negotiator. And although on the one hand, Reynolds, Raschi, and Lopat, the big three in the Yankee pitching staff in the early 50s, were team leaders and helped the Yankees win, their tough negotiating, especially Raschi, annoyed George Weiss. So when Weiss had a chance to break them up, he eventually did, starting in 54 when he traded Raschi to your Cardinals.
Yeah, my Cardinals. I like to think of that. We're just about to the end of the game. We're almost at the end of the show, and so I'm going to ask you to hazard a guess about who's going to end up in the World Series, and then when we get to the fall and we know how it works, we'll do some Monday morning quarterbacking. You can come back and tell me about the World Series from your point of view.
Okay, with the caveat that the so-called best team doesn't always win, as exemplified by the 01 Mariners, who won 116 games and the Yankees knocked them out. I'm going to go with the Cardinals in the National League. I think they have the best balance. They've been the best team in the National League for most of the year, and I think that's going to hold up. The American League, I think there's a lot of parity. I don't think my Yankees are even going to make the playoffs. I don't think there's really one standout team in the American League, but I think at this point I'm going to go with the Tigers, because even though Verlander's not having that good of a year by his standards, Scherzer has been very good. They've got the 1-2 punch as exemplified on the Sports Illustrated cover. Miguel Cabrera and Prince Fielder. Victor Martinez, their catcher, is back after being injured last year. So although I think there's other good teams, I'm going to go on a limb and say Tigers and Cardinals, which would rematch the 1934 series, 1968, and 2006.
That's fantastic. Okay, so I hope it turns out that way too. So we will talk about that after the fact and think about ways to put that into historical perspective. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. This is wonderful. And for those listeners who would like to find out more about our college, you can look us up online at mxcc.edu. I'm Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, wishing you a good day.